Without these structures, millions would not have survived until spring. But in the Middle Ages, people somehow managed to survive. Imagine a world where winter is not just a change of season, but a deadly enemy, where snow lies waist-deep and temperatures drop so low that every minute spent outdoors threatens frostbite. A world without central heating, warm clothes from the store, or electricity to turn on a heater. In the Middle Ages, for millions of people, this was not a scene from a movie, but a harsh, everyday reality. Watch the video to the end to learn how a simple solution in roof design could save an entire family from freezing to death, and how archaeological finds and experiments by reenactors are helping us uncover these ancient mysteries. Survival in the Middle Ages was a true art, where every choice and every detail was of utmost importance. It was a time when a person's life depended directly on their wisdom and ability to foresee danger. And one of the most important decisions that could save or destroy a family was the choice of location for their future home. It was not just a building, it was a fortress that protected against the harsh and unforgiving nature. An incorrectly located shelter could negate all efforts and condemn its inhabitants to a cold death in the very first winter. Therefore, the location for the future hut was chosen taking into account dozens of critical factors, each of which was a matter of life and death. A south or southeast-facing hillside was considered ideal. This location was not accidental. It ensured maximum use of the scarce winter sun, whose rays warmed the walls and penetrated through small window openings, providing warmth and light. At the same time, the hill itself served as a natural barrier against the fierce north winds that could pierce the dwelling through and through. Protection from the wind was more important than it seemed. Even the thickest and warmest walls were useless if the icy air penetrated through the smallest cracks, blowing out all the heat and causing the inhabitants to shiver with cold. At the same time, houses were never built on the very top of a hill or in a deep valley. The top was exposed to all the winds, and cold air accumulated in the valley, and worse, moisture. Dampness not only made life unbearable, but also led to frequent illnesses and a weakened body. The optimal location was considered to be in the middle of the slope, where warm air slowly flowed down and moisture did not accumulate, ensuring dryness and relative comfort. This place was called the comfort zone, where the forces of nature worked for the benefit of man, not against him. The key factor was proximity to a water source. A stream, lake, or spring had to be nearby, but not so close that spring floods would threaten the structure. The ability to find a stream protected from the wind was a real stroke of luck. Such a stream was less likely to freeze completely, providing access to water even in the most severe frosts, when everything around was frozen solid. Another important aspect was proximity to the forest. Firewood was the only source of heat, and every meter that had to be covered with a heavy bundle on one's back mattered. Therefore, huts were often built on the edges of forests, surrounded by dense woods that provided both fuel and building materials. The forest was not just a source, but a real treasure trove of resources. Experienced builders knew how to find suitable rich clay for insulating walls, thick, damp moss for caulking gaps, as well as birch bark and straw for creating a waterproof roof. All these materials had to be harvested in advance and in huge quantities in order to be ready for the onset of cold weather. The type of soil was also taken into account when choosing a location. Clay soil retained heat better, did not allow water to pass through, and allowed for the construction of strong, durable walls. Rocky soil, on the other hand, was cold and difficult to work with, making it practically impossible to build a house on the surface. In places with hard soil, they often dug dugouts, and in soft soil, they built huts on the surface using light wooden structures. Could people without modern tools and scientific knowledge really take so many factors into account? Of course. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, from father to son, from mother to daughter. Studying the location of medieval villages, their thoughtfulness and harmony with nature, shows that our ancestors possessed incredible intuition, observation skills, and attention to detail. For them, choosing the right place was not just a matter of convenience, but a whole science. Not only a comfortable winter, but the very life of the family depended on it. Do you think that the intuition and experience of our ancestors were more important than modern knowledge in matters of survival? Share your opinion in the comments. After choosing the perfect location, people began to build a hut, which was not just a dwelling, but a real survival machine. Its design, materials, and layout were aimed at one single goal: to retain every bit of heat and keep the freezing cold out. Every decision, from the choice of logs to the thickness of the roof, was based on centuries of experience accumulated by entire generations. This knowledge had been hard-won through harsh winters and severe frosts. The foundation of the hut was thick, carefully selected logs. Their diameter had to be at least 40 centimeters so that the walls could accumulate heat from the hearth during the day, like a huge oven, and slowly release it at night, warming those who slept. The logs were fitted together with incredible, almost jeweler's precision, using primitive but surprisingly effective tools. This precision was critical, as any gap could become a bridge for the cold. The gaps between the logs were caulked so that there was not a single gap left. Moss, clay, wood chips, and sometimes even animal wool were used. This mixture dried out, turning into a dense, impermeable monolith that not only insulated, but also served as protection against rodents and insects. Sometimes the outside of the walls was additionally coated with clay, mixed with manure and straw. This mixture dried out, forming another layer of insulation, which also made the hut more resistant to moisture. The floor in the huts was usually made of earth. It was trampled down, mixed with clay and sand to make it dense and smooth, and then covered with a thick layer of straw or animal skins. But this was not enough. For additional insulation, a small depression was dug under the floor and filled with dry leaves, moss, or sawdust. This layer prevented the cold creeping along the ground from penetrating from below and cooling the dwelling. The roof, the most vulnerable part of the house, was a true work of art. It was built with a steep slope so that snow would slide off rather than accumulate. At the same time, a thin layer of snow was desirable as it served as additional insulation, creating an air cushion. The roof could be up to half a meter thick or more. It consisted of several layers, each of which had its own function. First came a layer of birch bark, which did not allow water to pass through. Then came a thick layer of moss or hay, which served as the main insulation. And on top was turf, straw, or reeds. Turf was especially good. It fit snugly to the frame and over time sprouted, turning the roof into a living grass carpet that retained heat and protected from rain, creating unique and durable insulation. Windows were very rare. They were replaced by small openings covered with oiled parchment or animal bladders. These windows were located only on the south side to capture maximum sunlight. In severe frosts, they were tightly closed with wooden shutters insulated with hay or straw. The door was double. An air vestibule was created between the outer and inner leaves. It prevented cold air from entering the house every time it was opened, functioning like a modern airlock. The threshold was made high so that the cold creeping along the ground would not penetrate the dwelling. The whole family lived in one room, with the hearth or stove at its center. The sleeping places were located on a raised platform, on the floorboards or on the second tier, since warm air always rises. This allowed them to sleep in the warmth, even if the floor was cold. How many hours of work do you think it took to build such a hut? Share your guesses in the comments. In the next chapter, we will talk about an amazing discovery: dugouts, which were not just holes in the ground, but real underground houses, about which modern science knows some surprising things. When it comes to dugouts, we often imagine something primitive and uncomfortable, a kind of temporary shelter for a hermit. However, archaeological finds and experiments by modern reconstructors show a completely different picture. Dugouts were the pinnacle of engineering thought for survival in harsh conditions. These were not just holes in the ground, but complex, meticulously designed underground houses that provided people with unprecedented protection from the cold, wind, and enemies. The main and undeniable advantage of an earthen hut is the use of the Earth's own heat. At a depth of 1 to 2 meters, the temperature remains stable and above freezing even in the most severe frosts. This meant that maintaining a comfortable temperature inside required significantly less firewood than in an above-ground hut. Fuel economy was a key factor in survival, as firewood had to be obtained through hard labor. In a dugout, there was no need to fight the cold that penetrated through the walls and floor. It used a natural heat accumulator. The construction of a dugout began with digging a pit, which was hard and time-consuming work that required the coordinated efforts of the entire family. An important element was the ventilation system. A completely sealed dugout could lead to the accumulation of moisture and carbon monoxide, which was deadly. Therefore, small holes were made at the top for fresh air to enter, which could be closed in case of strong winds or snowstorms. These chimneys also served to release smoke from the hearth. The roof of the dugout was multi-layered, like that of an above-ground hut, but even more effective. It was made of logs, then covered with a layer of moss and hay, and topped with a thick layer of earth dug out for the foundation pit. The earth, mixed with plant roots, became a natural insulating layer that not only retained heat but also protected from rain. This roof was so strong that people and animals could walk on it, making it virtually invisible and impenetrable. The hearth or stove in the dugout was located in the center, but their genius lay not in their location, but in the smoke extraction system. The smoke was removed through special channels dug in the ground or made of stones, which ran under the floor. In this way, the escaping smoke gave heat to the ground, which in turn heated the floor and walls. It was an ingenious heat exchanger that allowed precious heat to be retained and used to its fullest. The interior layout of the dugout was as functional as possible. Along the perimeter, there were beds covered with straw and skins, and in the center there was free space for a hearth and household needs. In some dugouts, archaeologists found special niches in the walls for storing supplies, which indicates the thoughtfulness and long-term use of these dwellings. Unlike above-ground huts, dugouts were almost invisible. Their roofs, covered with earth and grass, blended in with the landscape, providing additional protection from enemies and predators. It was not just a shelter, but a real underground fortress. Archaeological excavations in Europe and Scandinavia have uncovered entire settlements of dugouts that were inhabited for centuries. These findings refute the notion of dugouts as temporary and primitive shelters. In fact, they were permanent, reliable, and very warm homes. Experiments by reenactors show that a properly constructed dugout can maintain a comfortable temperature using only a few logs per day. This made them an ideal solution for survival in harsh winter conditions. What other advantages do you think dugouts might have had that we haven't mentioned? For example, protection from wind or forest fires? The center of any medieval dwelling, whether a hut or a dugout, was the hearth. It was not just a source of heat, but the true heart of the home, around which the whole family's life revolved. Its proper construction and maintenance determined not only the warmth of the house, but also the preparation of food and even the safety of all the household members. It was a multifunctional system without which survival would have been impossible. The simplest hearth was a pit in the ground lined with stones. But the truly effective, ingenious design that has survived to this day was the Russian stove. Its massive walls, made of clay, stones, and unfired bricks, accumulated a huge amount of heat. It was a kind of giant battery that slowly and evenly gave off heat throughout the day. One stoking, which took several hours, was enough to maintain a comfortable temperature for 24 hours, which was an incredible saving of energy and time. The design of the stove was thought out down to the smallest detail. Smoke channels were laid through the entire thickness of the stove, forcing hot gases to travel a complex path and give off maximum heat to the stone mass. Pipe was not vertical but curved, which further increased heat transfer and allowed every degree to be used. It was a true prototype of modern heating systems where everything was aimed at maximum efficiency. A sleeping place, a couch, was always arranged on the stove. It was the warmest place in the house, where the elderly and sick slept to ensure maximum comfort and health. The temperature of the couch was maintained at a comfortable 30 degrees, even in the most severe frosts, which made it a real oasis of warmth. The stove's chimney was not only a means of removing smoke, it was used for smoking meat and fish. The products were hung over the hearth, where they were treated with warm smoke, which increased their shelf life many times over. It was a primitive but very effective method of preservation, which allowed food to be stored for the long winter. Mushrooms, berries, and herbs were also dried in the oven. Properly lighting the oven required real skill. First, small chips and birch bark were lit, which quickly gave off heat, and then larger pieces of wood were gradually added. Inexperienced lighting could lead to smoke in the house or incomplete combustion of fuel, which resulted in the loss of precious heat and resources. Fuel was prepared in advance in huge quantities. One family needed 15 to 20 cubic meters of firewood for the winter. Firewood was chopped, split, and stacked in wood piles in the summer so that it would have time to dry. Dry firewood burned hotter and more efficiently, which meant that it saved energy. Cleaning the stove and chimney was a regular procedure. Soot not only reduced draft and efficiency, but could also lead to a fire, which was one of the main dangers in a medieval home. Chimneys were cleaned with special tools, and the stove itself was scraped several times during the winter. It was hard but vital work. What part of the medieval hearth do you think was the most dangerous for the household and why? Medieval people were not always in the warmth and safety of their homes. Hunters, traders, shepherds, and travelers often found themselves outdoors, caught in a sudden storm or severe frost. In such situations, the ability to quickly build a temporary shelter was a matter of life and death. These shelters may have seemed primitive, but they were thought out down to the smallest detail, based on a deep understanding of nature and its laws. The simplest shelter was a hut made of sturdy branches, covered with a thick layer of spruce branches, moss, or fallen leaves. It was built using natural barriers, fallen trees, rocks, or dense bushes, which served as a frame and additional protection from the wind. Inside, the floor was lined with dry moss or fallen leaves to create an insulating layer between the body and the cold ground. Such a shelter protected from wind, snow, and rain, but did not provide warmth. It was protection from external factors, not a source of internal comfort. A canopy was more reliable. It was made of poles covered with a thick layer of bark or animal skins, if available. The canopy was placed on a slope facing away from the wind to serve as a barrier against the weather. A fire was lit under the canopy, which provided warmth, light, and the ability to cook food. The canopy was more open, but thanks to the fire, it provided much greater comfort. Snow shelters were a real lifesaver in regions with heavy snowfall. Snow is not just a cold mass, but also an excellent heat insulator. Experienced hunters and travelers knew how to build an igloo or a snow cave, where the temperature inside could stay above zero even in the most severe frosts. This required dense, compacted snow that could be cut into blocks. Inside such a shelter, the human body and the flame of a candle or small fire created enough heat for survival. An earthen shelter was more labor-intensive, but also more reliable. A person would dig a small pit and cover it with branches, pine needles, and snow. A small fire was lit inside to heat the shelter. It was practically invisible to enemies and predators, which gave it an additional advantage. In addition, the earth, as in dugouts, served as a natural heat accumulator, and its temperature was higher than the air temperature. Temporary camps for hunters or shepherds often consisted of several shelters. A large fire was lit in the center, around which huts or shelters were placed. This allowed not only to keep warm, but also to cook food and keep wild animals at a distance. The fire was the center of the community, a place where people shared news and planned further actions. Sometimes natural caves were used as shelters. They were cleared of snow and ice, and the entrance was covered with skins. The cave provided reliable protection from the wind and cold, but required a constant fire to combat dampness and provide warmth. What do you think was the most difficult part of building such temporary shelters in the wilderness? The walls of huts and dugouts were not just part of the structure, but a complex engineering system, the main impenetrable barrier against the freezing cold. They were built using only available natural materials and centuries of experience accumulated by generations and passed down by word of mouth. The thickness, density, and composition of the walls determined whether the house would be cozy and warm or bitterly cold. Every builder knew that a wall should not only hold up the structure, but also provide reliable protection from wind, frost, moisture, and even wild animals. Wood, warmth and tradition. The most common material, of course, was timber or logs. Walls were cut from thick, massive tree trunks, most often pine, spruce, or oak. These trees were not chosen at random. They had to be straight and strong. The logs were carefully fitted together using axes and other primitive but incredibly effective tools. At the joints where the logs crossed, special notches were made, so-called bowls and grooves, which ensured a tight fit and prevented wind from penetrating inside. These notches were filled with moss, which had unique properties. It was an excellent insulator, did not rot, and when wet, it swelled, making the joint even tighter. Stone and clay, strength and insulation. In treeless regions where wood was rare, walls were built from stones collected in fields or riverbeds. Stone houses were stronger and more durable than wooden ones. They were not susceptible to fire or rodents, but they were much colder, as stone does not retain heat well. To solve this problem, the stones were laid on a thick clay mortar, and the outside of the walls was additionally coated with a thick layer of clay mixed with chopped straw, which acted as a reinforcing mesh, and manure, which made the mixture more sticky and durable. As this layer dried, it formed a kind of thermal coat that significantly improved thermal insulation. Adobe walls. Another common solution was walls made of a mixture of fatty clay, straw, and sand. This mixture was kneaded with the feet, adding water until it became homogeneous, then laid in layers which were tamped down to give them maximum density. Such walls were strong and retained heat well, acting as heat accumulators. They heated up slowly from the fire and cooled down slowly. After drying, they became as hard as stone and were not affected even by severe frosts. The thickness of the walls was critically important. In cold climates, it could reach half a meter, and in some cases even more, which allowed the house to accumulate and retain heat. But it wasn't just about thickness. The interior walls were also made thick, which improved thermal insulation, protected against drafts, and created a kind of thermos inside the house. Multi-layering was the key to success. The interior decoration of the walls was minimal but functional. Most often, they were simply coated with a thin layer of clay, sometimes mixed with lime to give it a white color. This not only made the room brighter, but also protected the wood from moisture and insects. In wealthy homes, the walls could be covered with boards and even decorated with paintings or carvings, which was an indicator of the family's high status. Thus, the walls of a medieval dwelling were not just a pile of materials, but a carefully thought-out, multi-layered structure, where each element performed its function, providing warmth and safety. Do you think that construction crews existed in the Middle Ages, or did everyone build their own houses, helping each other? Share your thoughts in the comments. The entrance to a medieval dwelling was not just a door, but a whole complex of protective structures thought out to the smallest detail. Its design was aimed at minimizing the loss of precious heat and preventing the penetration of drafts that could cool the house in a matter of minutes. These solutions were simple but very effective, and each element of the entrance played its part in the struggle for survival. The most common and ingenious solution was a double door. A small vestibule was created between the outer and inner doors, which acted as a thermal lock. It was a small, unheated space that served as a buffer between the harsh cold of the street and the warm house. When a person entered, they first opened the outer door, then quickly entered the vestibule and closed it behind them. Cold air entered the vestibule but did not penetrate the house. Then the person closed the outer door and only then opened the inner door, which led directly into the warm dwelling. This system allowed heat to be retained without escaping every time someone entered or left. The doors were made of thick, solid boards, which themselves served as a good insulator. But that was not enough. To improve thermal insulation, they were often insulated on the inside, covered with animal skins, for example, sheepskin or bearskin, thick fabric, or felt. These materials not only helped to retain heat but also dampen noise, creating a cozy atmosphere inside the house. Particular attention was paid to air tightness. The gaps between the door frame and the door leaf were filled with moss or rags. A bag of sand or straw was always placed on the threshold, which fit snugly against the bottom of the door to prevent cold air from entering from below. This simple but effective technique helped combat the so-called creeping cold that spread across the ground. Doorways were made deliberately low and narrow to minimize contact with cold air. To enter, one had to bend over, and sometimes even crouch down. But this was not an inconvenience, but part of survival. The smaller the opening, the less heat escaped from the house, and the less cold penetrated inside. In addition, the low opening made it difficult for enemies or wild animals to enter. In some huts, especially the more primitive ones, the entrance was covered with a thick skin or a dense piece of fabric, which served as additional protection from wind and snow. Such a door was not completely airtight, but it was more effective than an open doorway and was easy to replace if worn out. Door locks were primitive, but very reliable. Most often, simple wooden bolts, latches, or hooks were used to close the door from the inside. These locks were easy to make, rarely broke, and did not require complex tools. In later and more affluent buildings, metal locks appeared that were closed with a key. Keys were a kind of status symbol, as metal was very expensive. Every element of the entrance to a medieval dwelling was well thought out and had its own purpose: to keep the heat in and ensure safety. It was not just a solution, but a whole complex of knowledge developed over centuries. What do you think was the biggest risk in building such an entrance, and why? The floor in medieval dwellings was not just a surface on which the inhabitants of the house walked. It was a vital element of the thermal insulation of the entire building, which had many hidden advantages and played a key role in the survival of people in harsh climatic conditions. Its sophisticated design was specifically aimed at minimizing the loss of precious heat as effectively as possible and reliably preventing the penetration of destructive dampness, which could destroy not only the structure of the house itself, but also the health of its inhabitants. It was an incredibly complex, carefully thought-out, multi-layered system where each individual element had its own strictly defined purpose and worked in harmony with other components to achieve maximum efficiency. The most common and affordable solution for ordinary peasants was the traditional earthen floor. It was relatively simple to install and did not require significant material costs. The earth in the hut or dugout was simply methodically tamped down with special wooden tampers to a state of maximum density and hardness. This process could take several days and required the participation of the entire family. To make the finished floor significantly stronger, more durable, and better at retaining vital heat, it was carefully covered with a thick layer of local clay, which was pre-mixed with manure from domestic animals and finely chopped straw or hay. The clay in this mixture made the surface perfectly smooth and extremely hard, capable of withstanding constant stress from walking and placing furniture. Manure and chopped straw acted as reliable binding elements and effective reinforcement, preventing cracking and destruction of the coating. Organic fibers created an internal mesh that gave the entire structure additional strength and flexibility. After complete drying, which could take from a week to a month depending on weather conditions, such a multi-layered floor became surprisingly dense, sufficiently warm, and relatively waterproof. However, it required constant and careful maintenance. It had to be regularly swept with special brooms, dirt had to be removed, and the top layer of clay had to be periodically renewed, especially in areas of greatest wear. Often a thick, soft layer of fresh straw, fragrant hay, or tanned animal skins was laid on top of the main covering, creating another important insulating layer and making the floor much softer and more comfortable for bare feet. Wooden floors were much more expensive to make and required significantly more physical effort, time, and high-quality materials. Thick wooden planks, carefully processed and fitted together, were laid on special joists, sturdy horizontal beams made of hardwood, which rested securely directly on compacted earth or on neatly laid small flat stones. The distance between the joists was calculated taking into account the expected load and the thickness of the boards. The space under the floor, formed between the ground and the wooden boards, was never left completely empty, as this would lead to significant heat loss. It was methodically filled with a thick, even layer of carefully dried leaves from various trees, soft moss, fine wood shavings, or sifted sand. This voluminous layer of organic or mineral materials served as excellent thermal insulation, creating an effective air cushion that reliably prevented the cold penetrating from the ground from entering the living space from below. In addition to its main thermal insulation function, this carefully laid layer effectively protected wooden structures from the destructive effects of dampness and served as additional, reliable protection against pesky rodents and various harmful insects that could damage both the floor structure itself and the supplies stored in the house. The underfloor space was not only a convenient place for practical storage of various supplies, but also an extremely important element of the overall thermal insulation of the house and an effective system for preserving food for a long time. In this cool and protected space, families stored fresh vegetables from the new harvest, valuable medicinal plant roots, various grains and cereals, massive wooden barrels with salted vegetables and meat, as well as other vital supplies that needed to be reliably protected from both the destructive frost of the winter months and the exhausting heat and rapid spoilage of the summer. In some wealthy homes, the underground storage area was designed to be so deep and spacious that a person could stand upright in it and even move around with various items. This underground storage area was accessed via a specially designed small hatch with a tightly fitting lid, which was carefully and hermetically sealed with various seals to prevent precious heat from escaping from the main living space of the house and to prevent cold air from entering. A properly equipped underground space naturally maintained a relatively constant temperature, which was significantly higher than the ambient temperature during the cold winter months and significantly lower during the hot summer days. This underground space was reliably protected from destructive freezing thanks to the heat coming from the house, and at the same time served as an excellent natural refrigerator during the warm season, allowing food to stay fresh much longer. This system demonstrates the remarkable ingenuity and practical wisdom of medieval builders, who were able to create effective solutions using only available natural materials and the centuries-old experience of previous generations. Proper and well-designed ventilation was not just a desirable element of comfort, but a critical factor for physical survival in the harsh conditions of a medieval home. It was not simply a matter of convenience or a pleasant atmosphere, but literally a matter of life and death for all the inhabitants of the dwelling. Without a constant and sufficient supply of fresh, clean air, destructive dampness, deadly carbon monoxide from the constantly burning hearth, and many other harmful vapors inevitably accumulated in a closed dwelling, which could lead to serious chronic diseases and even painful death from poisoning. Organizing effective ventilation was a truly complex science and a delicate art, requiring a perfect and extremely delicate balance between ensuring a sufficient supply of vital fresh air and simultaneously preserving the precious heat obtained with such incredible effort and enormous expenditure of resources. In typical dugouts, which by their nature and design were almost completely enclosed and as airtight as possible, organizing high-quality ventilation became a particularly important and technically difficult task. Effective air circulation was provided through a system of specially designed and carefully positioned ventilation openings, which were professionally installed in thick walls or in the roof structure. These strategically important openings were made relatively small in size to minimize the loss of precious heat, and they could be securely closed when necessary with fitted wooden shutters or tightly packed bundles of dry hay. Experienced builders usually place these vents at different levels relative to the floor to ensure the most efficient, natural, and continuous circulation of air masses based on the fundamental laws of physics. Colder and denser fresh air, being significantly heavier than heated air, naturally flowed through the lower ventilation openings, while lighter, warm, moisture-saturated air containing dangerous carbon monoxide and harmful vapors from human and animal breath rose upward according to the laws of convection and exited through the upper vents. This ingeniously simple system, based on the elementary but infallible physical laws of natural convection, was surprisingly effective and allowed the dugout to maintain a sufficiently fresh and breathable air supply in a confined space, without creating dangerous and cooling drafts that could negate all efforts to conserve heat. In traditional above-ground wooden huts, quality ventilation was mainly provided through two main channels: through the single entrance door and through a specially designed chimney of the stove or simple hearth. The smoke rising from the constantly burning hearth created a powerful natural draft that intensively drew stagnant air from the entire interior space of the room, and along with it effectively removed all accumulated harmful gases, vapors, and excess moisture. The fresh air necessary for life entered the hut through numerous natural cracks in the walls, formed as a result of the drying of the wood, and through specially left unsealed gaps between the individual logs of the log cabin. In some of the most advanced and technically sophisticated homes of wealthy families, craftsmen created special underground ventilation channels that skillfully ran directly under the floor structure. These engineering structures provided a stable flow of fresh outside air, which, slowly passing through the relatively warm earth, was naturally heated to a comfortable temperature close to that of the human body. This air, preheated by nature, entered the living space gently and evenly, without creating unpleasant and unhealthy drafts or cooling down the carefully heated house. This revolutionary system for its time was in fact an ancient prototype of modern high-tech supply ventilation systems, but it used only natural processes and physical laws, requiring no additional expenditure of scarce energy or complex technical maintenance. Constant and properly organized circulation of fresh air was literally a matter of life and death, not just an element of comfort or convenience. And every family knew from bitter experience that without it, even the warmest and coziest house would inevitably become a breeding ground for dangerous diseases and a source of constant threat to life. What do you think was more difficult, providing ventilation in a dugout or in an above-ground hut? The roof was the most vulnerable part of a medieval building and, at the same time, its most important protective element. It bore the brunt of the wind, snow, and rain, and even the slightest leak could lead to the destruction of the house, spoilage of supplies, and disease. Therefore, strengthening the roof was a vital task that was approached with particular care. The wooden frame of the roof was made of thick, sturdy logs and beams. They had to withstand not only the weight of the roof itself, but also the enormous mass of snow that could accumulate during the winter. The beams were fastened together with special spikes and grooves, rather than nails, which were too expensive and unreliable. This design was very strong, flexible, and could withstand extreme loads. Often, a massive ridge beam was installed in the center of the roof, which served as the basis for the entire structure. The roof was covered with several layers of materials, each of which performed its own unique function, and together they formed a reliable, watertight protection. After the roof was built, it was carefully checked for gaps. Every gap between the logs and structural elements was caulked with moss or clay. This work required time and patience, but it was vital to ensure tightness and heat retention. Which of these roof elements do you think was the most difficult to make, and why? We conclude our immersion into the world of medieval shelters. We have seen that huts, dugouts, and temporary shelters were not just primitive structures, but complex, well-thought-out machines for survival. Every detail and every material had its own function, and together they formed a unified system that helped people survive in the harshest conditions. Their experience proves that human ingenuity, knowledge of nature, and resourcefulness can overcome the most serious difficulties. This knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, has become the basis for our survival in the world. Which of these medieval engineering solutions do you consider the most ingenious? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn how our ancestors built fortresses and cities using the same principles.